This week, a historic transfer of power and a historic winter storm.
As temperatures plunged across the South and a large part of the country, Georgia and Washington prepared for the start of President Donald Trump's second term.
In D.C., Donald Trump's swearing-in moved indoors. In Atlanta, some put on hats, gloves, and overcoats for a Martin Luther King Jr. Day march outside Ebenezer Baptist Church.
Charles Abrams of Atlanta told me he's preparing to push back on the coming changes.
What that means for immigrants, what that means for LGBTQ plus people, what it means for women. It's up to us to really reach in and find our humanity.
Inside a warm Midtown restaurant, state Republicans welcomed Trump's return to power.
I'm just like the rest of most conservatives in Georgia. We're really excited about what we see, hopeful for the economy, hopeful for the future.
That's Senator Blake Tillery, who's one of the lead state budget writers.
This was supposed to be budget week at the state capitol. Then came the ice and snow.
A lot of folks just went to sleep in their cars and went to sleep in their trucks. And so even after we opened up the roadway, we had to send operators down through there knocking on doors and blowing sirens and horns.
Meanwhile, in D.C., Trump pardoned defendants connected to the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, including dozens from Georgia. Today, we'll hear from one of them.
And hearings got underway for the first of Trump's nominees from Georgia.
The VA will be my mission. It will be the mission to take care of our veterans and to make sure they get the benefits that they deserve.
And here at home, state officials moved to respond to bird flu in 2 commercial flocks.
If we were our own country, we would be the 8th largest producer of poultry in the world. The impact on our state economy, the impact on farm families is significant.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast. So let's begin in Washington with some of the early moves during the new Trump administration. Congress passed the Laken-Riley Act, an immigration bill named for a nursing student killed last year on the campus of UGA. A man who authorities say entered the U.S. illegally was later found guilty of murder.
That's right. The Laken-Riley Act allows federal agents to detain undocumented immigrants accused of crimes like theft or shoplifting. Senators Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff both voted yes on this act, 2 of the 12 Democrats to support it in the Senate. And when the bill came back to the House, Democrats Lucy McBath and Sanford Bishop also voted in favor, along with Georgia's Republicans. This follows a Georgia law passed last year that requires local sheriffs check the status of anyone they think is not in the country legally. Rahul, there is still a lot of debate over exactly how these laws will work in practice, and also whether they could have prevented Laken-Riley's death.
So, Sam, immigration is going to be one of those areas we're going to continue to keep tabs on. This week, we also saw former Georgia Congressman Doug Collins appear before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee as he seeks confirmation to be the next Secretary of Veteran Affairs. Look, I've covered Collins. He's a Trump loyalist. He defended the president during impeachment hearings, and later he challenged Kelly Loeffler in the race for U.S. Senate.
But Rahul, in his confirmation hearing, he also emphasized his willingness to work in a bipartisan fashion and his experience as an Air Force Reserve chaplain who served in Iraq.
I understand burn pits because I slept next to one for many months. I understand this generation that went for time and time again, deployment after deployment.
If confirmed, Collins will face issues that have long plagued the VA, this agency that provides health care to millions of veterans, including in Georgia. Issues like aging facilities and backlogs. Collins said he'd continue a controversial push that began during the first Trump administration to expand access to private care outside the VA. And he also declined to say whether he'd revoke a Biden administration rule allowing the VA to provide abortion services in cases of rape, incest, or to protect the health of the veteran. He seemed to indicate that he disagreed that this rule should stay in effect. But the committee still advanced Collins' nomination with bipartisan support. He only got one no Democratic vote. The nomination next goes in front of the full Senate. Now, Rahul, we're still awaiting confirmation hearings to be scheduled for former Senator Kelly Loeffler, who's been nominated to run the Small Business Administration, and David Perdue, who's Trump's pick to be the next ambassador to China.
And Sam, while we wait for those, you've been looking at one of Trump's earliest actions, issuing sweeping presidential pardons for those convicted of crimes related to the January 6th insurrection.
That's right, Rahul. There were more than 40 defendants with connections to Georgia. More than a dozen of those were facing charges related to violence or assault. 6 of the more than 40 Georgia defendants in total had already been convicted at trial, according to an NPR database, including Jake Maxwell.
I'm just over 24 hours of cutting off the ankle bracelet, and the emotion of being able to actually try and understand that I'm free. I can go anywhere I want and not have to ask permission anymore. And it's an amazing feeling. My brain is like rewired.
Maxwell's 23 now. He lives north of Atlanta near Lake Lanier. He went to Washington, D.C. ahead of January 6, 2021 to support Trump and protest the election result, which he says he believes was fraudulent. He'd even met Trump by chance in Ireland on a vacation a few years prior. Maxwell was at Trump's rally at the Ellipse when the president encouraged a march on the Capitol. Prosecutors say Maxwell was part of the crowd that breached police lines and pushed its way to the inaugural stage in the Upper West Terrace of the U.S. Capitol. Prosecutors say footage shows Maxwell laughing, cheering, and waving a flag as some of the worst violence of the day occurred nearby, though Maxwell did not go inside the Capitol building.
So, Sam, what else did prosecutors allege?
Prosecutors say Maxwell stayed at the Capitol for hours despite the violence unfolding there. Citing body cam footage, prosecutors accused Maxwell of assaulting 2 police officers amid the chaos. Maxwell denied the assault allegations and disputed prosecutors' interpretation of the footage. He was arrested in 2022 and charged on 7 counts. In November 2023, Maxwell pleaded not guilty to all of them at a bench trial. The judge found Maxwell not guilty on 4 counts, including those charges connected to allegations that he assaulted the 2 police officers. But the judge did find Maxwell guilty on the 3 other counts, including disorderly and disruptive conduct in a restricted building or grounds. A few weeks after Trump was elected to a second term in November 2024, the judge sentenced Maxwell to 18 months probation, including 6 months in home detention and $1,500 in restitution for repairs to the Capitol. Though Maxwell continues to say he's innocent on the charges, he felt the judge had been fair.
I prayed many prayers throughout this process, and one of them was for a just and fair trial, and I told him that I believe he gave me that opportunity.
This week, Maxwell was serving that sentence at home in Georgia and watching TV with his family as President Trump announced the pardons. And on Wednesday, Maxwell was able to remove his ankle bracelet about 2 months into his sentence.
Sam, I really wonder, how are prosecutors who worked on these cases for years processing this news?
I spoke with former U.S. Attorney Alexis Loeb, who until just recently served as deputy chief of the section focused on January 6 cases for the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. For 3 years, Loeb worked on these prosecutions. She did not work on Maxwell's case, but she did supervise the case against a defendant from Savannah, who until this week had a sentencing set for next month. Loeb said, of course, she's disappointed, but she thinks the work was still important.
The government detailed in its filings and in the proof at trial what these defendants did. And no matter whether they served a sentence or not, that is something that I hope will eventually be the definitive truth about what happened that day.
I asked Loeb how she's processing the pardons broadly.
Really, my main concern here is for the victims, particularly the police officers who were brutally attacked that day, and what it means for them to have the people who attacked them walk free.
Loeb told me one aim of her team's efforts was to deter something like January 6th from ever happening again.
It is something I think about now. What is the message this sends about political violence? And what is the message this sends about elections and respecting the results of the elections and upholding the peaceful transfer of power going forward.
As for Maxwell, he told me he hopes President Trump will take on the justice system that he says unfairly targeted him and others who were at the Capitol.
I absolutely hope that we can get our Department of Justice under control. And it has been a travesty. I mean, from what all of our families had to go through, it's very disheartening, but it's pretty amazing to be able to have all my rights back at 23 years old, believing that I would be a convicted felon for the rest of my life.
Trump, for his part, has vowed to use the justice system to pursue retaliation against his political opponents. In a memo, Maxwell's lawyers told the judge ahead of sentencing that their client accepted responsibility for his actions, regretted being at the Capitol on January 6th, and said he should have known it was improper. So I asked Maxwell if he felt that way today.
I am who I am today because of everything that's ever led up to this point. I mean, so I wouldn't do anything different because I am 100% innocent.
Sam, that was really striking. And really, thanks for tracking both of these voices down. I feel like it helps me and hopefully helps our audience understand the ramifications of this big news and these big developments this week. We'll leave it there. We'll be right back after a quick break. This is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Let's go back to the state capitol now, where Budget Week had a rough go, with hearings canceled and postponed due to the inclement weather. But Rahul, recognizing the importance of the state budget, passing it is the one constitutionally mandated task of the General Assembly. What has stood out to you in starting to take a look at these numbers?
So let me start with reminding our audience of what lawmakers are actually working on. This session, like every session, they have two budgets to work on. The amended fiscal year 2025 budget makes changes to the current state government funding. Then there's the 2026 budget that kicks in July 1st. Today, I'm just going to focus on the amended 2025 budget, where Governor Kemp is proposing adding $4 billion more to that budget, taking it from about $36 billion to $40 billion. Most of that coming from the surpluses the state has built up in recent years. One big focus, hurricane and storm recovery. There's $615 million for paying expenses already occurred, like road cleaning, agricultural loans, the gas tax suspension right after Hurricane Helene. The proposal also includes state and local matching funds to get federal aid here in the next couple of months. And kind of longer term, Sam, are tax breaks for about $450 million. That's going to be to help replant timberlands and rebuilding poultry houses that were destroyed by some of the hurricanes and some of the major storms. Separately, there's another $1.5 billion for infrastructure projects, including $500 million for the Hyundai plant near Savannah, $500 million for freight projects, and then $250 million for roads, along with another $250 million for local water and sewer projects. Also, there's an acceleration of state income tax cuts. Look, overall, the key to this, and it's not new, is spending surpluses on one-time expenses or funding, not like longer-term projects or longer-term proposals.
So, a quiet week at the Capitol, but Rahul, there are a few bills you've been starting to keep tabs on. I've been calling it Rahul's bag of bills. What do you got for me this week?
I kind of like that. So let's dive into the bag. There's already, Sam, 118 House bills, 26 Senate bills, along with, of course, plenty of resolutions. There are so many things that get my attention, and one of the things that always sticks out at me is I look at the bill's sponsors, and if it's a very bipartisan bill, it jumps out at me. And one of those, House Bill 82, the Georgia Guest Worker Act. Republican State Representative Matt Reeves of Gwinnett County talked to me and explains what the bill does.
It establishes an area of Georgia government. We house it in the Department of Labor, where the Georgia Department of Labor can work with Georgia employers to identify unmet workforce needs. Georgia would approach the federal immigration authorities, work with present immigration laws for legal, temporary guest workers to come to Georgia.
Some of the areas that would be focused on: healthcare, nursing, construction, even agriculture. Employers would have to commit to paying for health insurance and other expenses. Reeves does push back on the argument that this would take jobs away from Georgians, but definitely a bill I'm going to be following.
Rahul, what else should we be paying attention to?
So, not to bring up the November elections again, but, I always interested to see legislation that comes out of things you heard on the campaign trail, and that's the case with Senate Bill 2, which is connected to President Trump's promise to end federal income taxes on tips. This bill would end state income tax on tips. I asked the bill's sponsor, Republican State Senator Greg Dolezal of Forsyth County, about the possibility of abuse, specifically folks trying to claim more of their income as tips.
I think that's something we would have to monitor. So the intent of that right now is for the people who are providing on tip money to earn a living. Obviously, tend to be in some of the lower income brackets in the state of Georgia, and we want to relieve the tax burden on them if we can.
Now, the other thing we heard on the campaign trail, Sam, was Trump's idea of ending income taxes on overtime pay. Dolezal says he's supportive of that and that it could be added to this bill or be a separate bill. So Senate Bill 2, House Bill 82, just some of the bills we'll be following.
All right, I want to go a few blocks over from the Capitol now to the Albert Tuttle U.S. Court of Appeals building over on Forsyth Street to talk about an important oral argument that happened on Thursday.
Yeah, this is the fight over Georgia's redistricting maps. And by the way, Sam, I did finally put up the 2023-2024 legislative and congressional maps in our state capitol office. But Sam, tell us about this case.
Rahul, let's start with some background. State lawmakers drew new district lines for the state legislature and Congress after the 2020 census. Some groups of voters challenged those maps in court, arguing they violated the Federal Voting Rights Act by diluting the voting power of Black voters. In 2023, a federal district judge agreed and ordered new maps be drawn. That fall, the legislature did draw new maps that added some majority Black districts, and those maps are now in effect. But Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger continued to challenge the order to draw new maps on appeal. And this week, a 3-judge panel on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit heard oral arguments to consider whether the lower court judge applied the law correctly here in ordering the maps be redrawn.
So what happened, Sam?
Rahul, this appeal is focused on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits voting practices that discriminate on race, color, or language. This Section 2, has been really heavily litigated over the years, including in some recent landmark court decisions. Now, the state of Georgia says there is no Section 2 violation with their original maps because any difficulties at the ballot box faced by Black candidates can be explained by partisan politics, not by race. This is Georgia Solicitor General Stephen Petrani going back and forth with Judge Robin Rosenbaum.
There's plenty of indication here that there's partisanship. There's almost no indication that any voting patterns are shifting one way or the other because of either the race of the candidate or the
that just sort of ignores history and the reason why so many Black voters happen to vote for the Democratic Party, ignores the history of what's happened, over 200 plus years in Georgia.
What Rosenbaum is referring to there is racial polarization in Georgia, where the majority of Black voters support Democrats and white voters support Republicans, a shift that happened in response to Democrats' support for voting and civil rights during the middle of the 20th century. But the state here is also arguing something broader, that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act might not even be relevant today.
It can't be that, the sins of the past forever taint everything that Georgia is doing.
And Rahul, that gets to the bigger picture here beyond just the debate over Georgia's maps. The state is also challenging whether private citizens can bring Section 2 claims, if the courts eventually find that they can't, that would leave only the Department of Justice to do this, which under the Trump administration is very unlikely to bring them. So this would essentially gut the power of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And another question here is whether the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional entirely at this point in time. This appellate panel is made up of one judge appointed by Trump, one appointed by Bill Clinton, and one appointed by Barack Obama. And they seem poised to uphold the lower court's ruling redrawing the maps. But that could get appealed again. And if this makes it to the U.S. Supreme Court, a ruling there could have big implications, not just for Georgia, but for the Voting Rights Act writ large.
And Sam, here at home, if at the end of all of this, Georgia has to go back to the original maps drawn after the 2020 census for the 2026 or 2028 elections, it could be very messy, with implications for lawmakers suddenly not living in their districts. Some members may even be suddenly paired up against another state lawmaker. So something that we're going to be watching with this.
Okay, finally, I want to talk about some news farther afield from the state capitol, but one that has already required the state to take swift action. And that's the news this week of birds in 2 commercial flocks in northeast Georgia testing positive for the highly pathogenic avian influenza, or bird flu.
That's right, Sam. The Georgia Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Agriculture confirmed those cases in a pair of commercial poultry operations in Elbert County. Now, before these two, there had been some cases in like backyard and personal flocks, but now we're talking about massive flocks in the thousands. In this case, 175,000 chickens. That's led to the suspension of poultry exhibitions, shows, flea market sales, auctions. This does not affect retail sales where you and me go to the store to get, for example, eggs or chicken. Now, there has been a nationwide outbreak since 2022, but it has now made its way here. This is critical because poultry, and specifically chickens, are such a big deal for the state of Georgia.
Rahul, you had a chance to catch up with Georgia Agriculture Commissioner Tyler Harper, who has been really at the forefront of the state response to this development.
That's right, Sam. Very much like winter weather in Georgia, where the state government activates a command center to deal with issues around power, roads, and more, the State Department of Agriculture is kind of taking the same approach. Let's start by talking about why this is such a big deal for Georgia. You heard a little bit from Harper in the show open that this is a major part of Georgia's massive agriculture industry.
$84 billion industry. Of that $84 billion, over a third of that is poultry alone, over $30 billion. And so when you get to looking at that, the impact on our state economy, the impact on farm families, the impact on industry is significant every single day. And not only that, from a consumer perspective, these are the type things that increase cost of products at the grocery store, whether it's eggs or poultry products.
I did ask him about the safety of those products in retail stores.
So I can confidently say that there were no poultry products that entered the food supply chain that were contaminated or had HPAI because of the testing protocols we have in place. But on top of that, the significant protocols we have in place from the poultry houses to the grocery store and everywhere in between, our inspectors and our inspection protocols ensure that supply chain is safe.
And one thing we've been asked about is the safety of those involved in this situation. For example, who's culling or killing those 175,000 chickens in Elbert County? Harper tells me that includes his employees, contractors, and farm employees.
We set up a secure biosecurity perimeter. Matter of fact, our law enforcement division at the department, that was one of the things we did immediately, is we set up a secure perimeter. No one was allowed into that area unless you had a reason to be there. In other words, you were part of the operation. And within that area, there are other hot-cold lines. If you cross that line, you have to be in complete PPE, from face masks, gloves, chem tech suits, etc.
So, Sam, this is a story we have been following and will continue to follow, with coverage from a number of angles, including from our health, environmental, business, and, of course, politics team.
That's it for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast. If you love the Gold Dome Scramble podcast, you can find all of that rich analysis and context right here on Plugged In.
And you can help us by going over to the feed dedicated to Plugged In and leave us a rating or a review. It really helps us.
You can also keep tabs on this legislative session at wabe.org/under the gold dome.
Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Hellman.
Thanks for listening.